Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Asia Competitiveness Institute webinar on Resilience and Recovery, Asia's Post-Pandemic Economic Adjustments. My name is Terence and I will be the moderator for today's session. Today's webinar is timely as over a year has passed since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which some of us have called the crisis of our generation. While the virus is still raging in many parts of the world, we are now seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, with vaccines being rolled out and the global economy poised for a rebound this year. Yet we know that COVID-19 will have an impact that lasts beyond the outbreak of the disease. It is already reshaping the way we live, work and play, the way we learn and how we interact with one another. It will also cause permanent changes in the structure of economies, in the mix of industries and firms, in production networks and investment flows. So it is vital to understand the impact of COVID-19 in these various dimensions. Today's webinar focuses on the economic impact of COVID-19 on Asian economies, and in particular, what underpins the resilience and recovery of these economies. The papers to be presented today will cover economic dynamics in selected Asian economies, the role of regional production networks in propagating economic impact, and also how cross-border investments have been affected by the pandemic. These papers and research come from different angles, but collectively they will provide valuable insights into how Asian economies have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and what the future may hold. We are privileged to have with us this afternoon three eminent speakers to share on these topics. First, we will have ACI Senior Research Advisor, Dr. Tilak Abising, who has developed a forward-looking economic trick methodology to project the potential growth and recovery of economies under different scenarios that may manifest. Together with his collaborator Tan Kuan, he has applied this methodology to study economic dynamics in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Next, we will have Senior Research Fellow Dr. Xie Taojin, who will speak on the role of China-ASEAN production network in explaining economic spillovers during pandemic-induced downturns. By comparing the experience of COVID-19 and SARS, his research will also shed light on how the role of this production network has evolved over time. Finally, we will have Assistant Professor Zheng Huan, who will present a study on how cross-border FDI has been affected by the pandemic and infection rates across countries. And to respond to these presentations, we have invited two discussants, Dr. To Man Heng, who is Honorary Fellow of NUS Business School and Senior Research Advisor at ACI, as well as Assistant Professor Sanjana Goswami from the LKY School of Public Policy. We look forward to hearing their comments and insights. But first, let me invite Dr. Tilak to present his findings.
Okay, thank you, Terence. Let me share the screen. Okay. Now, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. These are three separate studies Kuan and I conducted. My challenge today is to summarize these three separate studies in 15 minutes. I will try. Now, to sort of an introduction, let me share with you some graphs I recently prepared. Now, here, is COVID-19 a rich man's disease? This was an idea that has been spreading at the initial stages because it was spread by international travelers who are relatively well off. Even in countries like Germany, it spread to rich districts first. But even today, when you look at this graph, per capita income and cases per million population, it looks as if that rich countries are getting more cases. But actually, this kind of a graph is very misleading because of this relationship. So this is the tests and cases. The more tests a country conducts, the more cases detected. So rich countries tend to perform more tests. As a result, more cases are detected, and poor countries don't have the resources to do that. Therefore, a more meaningful relationship can be found by looking at this graph. This one shows per capita income and cases per 1,000 tests. Now the graph is very much telling. So I have put this vertical line at $20,000. That is roughly the income, lowest income level an OECD country has. So all the rich countries, their number of cases per 1,000 is below 100. USA is a little bit high, so USA is ranked in terms of total number of cases as number one, but when you look at cases per 1,000 tests, it's very low. But on the other hand, here, a lot of poor countries have more cases per 1,000 tests. So therefore, basically the poor countries and the poor people in rich countries had to bear the burden of both the disease and the economic burden. So what the response has been? Of course, relief. Many governments have provided a lot of relief to households, but there is a concern whether income losses, the relief provided were less than the income losses. Then relief is a necessary condition for resilience and recovery. For resilience and recovery, there are three basic conditions that we see. One is the pandemic containment. The other is fiscal support that comes, relief comes under this. Now, this website I have given here is from Asian Development Bank that provides a summary of fiscal support provided to different countries. Then there is this built-in factors. Built-in factors. Now, this is a very important consideration because each country has to design and devise built-in factors for resilience depending on their specific circumstances they face. But let's see what advantages Taiwan had at this moment. Then restructuring and growth. I'm not going to spend much time on restructuring and growth. Typical people talk about growth, but I put this adjective in front, restructuring, because growth at this stage should go with some sort of restructuring. Now, one major contribution of these studies is this forward-looking methodology. I'm not going to spend much time on this, and the mathematics are found in the papers that are available in the ACI website. So assessing potential economic impact without data. So that's the problem. So basically, this is not a forecasting exercise. Forecastings are done quite a lot by IMF, World Bank, and all that. So this is to look at the sectoral dynamics without any policy interventions. What would be the dynamics like in different sectors? So this can provide early warning lights to steer the economy away from abysmal outcomes. Therefore, the whole objective is to provide warning lights. Therefore, there's no point of comparing these results with the actual outcome because actual outcomes will change. The basic model is an intervention model within the vector auto-regression framework. Excuse me, framework. So basically, it has two steps. One is sectoral growth interdependence. We estimate this using pre-crisis data. For this, we need a weight matrix. Need prior estimates for sector weights. We do this because vector auto-regressions become useless when you have so many variables. To overcome that problem, I introduced this weighting method. For Singapore and Hong Kong, we worked out these weights using the actual growth rates of the sectors directly. For Taiwan, we use input-output tables. Then the intervention. So in this case, the intervention is the COVID-19 outbreak. So it is captured by a dummy variable. So we need the parameters of this to be estimated. For this, we use a calibrating method. First, we use the whole vector auto-regression model to forecast each sector's growth for 4 quarters. And this is driven by two key variables, exogenous variables, growth rate of visitor arrivals and foreign GDP. Foreign GDP is the export share weighted GDP growth of the trading partners of each economy. So we had to assume values for these for the future. Visitor is easy, set to 0. Now, key aspect of this methodology, it provides the direct impact and indirect impact. Standard regression can provide only the direct impact, not the indirect impact. So optimistic scenario we assume was COVID-19 withers away within 2020. Now that is a big question mark. I'm not going to go through all the slides, because a lot of slides are there. So these Singapore and Hong Kong provides a very interesting contrast. Therefore, we put them together. Sector value-added shares of GDP. As you can see, Singapore manufacturing sector is the largest. Hong Kong manufacturing sector is very small. Wholesale and retail trade sector is the largest in Hong Kong and Singapore the second largest. Now, this is Singapore's largest sector, manufacturing, Singapore's two sectors, just to give you an idea about the dynamics that we would see under the optimistic scenario. In manufacturing, this blue line is the direct impact, and orange line is the indirect impact because of the other sectors. So the red line is the total. In the case of accommodation and food, which is directly affected by the visitor arrivals, as you can see, the direct impact is the largest, the blue line. So this is how the graphs look like. It looks like a V-shaped recovery. Now, in the case of Singapore, what do we see after 1 year? Actually, largely a V-shaped recovery, faster than projected because of the fiscal support. Now, our projected GDP growth was minus 5.3%. Official estimate is minus 5.4%. Now, these were the dynamics we projected, and this is the actual quarter-on-quarter growth rates. These vertical numbers cannot be compared, but the shape of the graph can be compared. And this zigzag is because of the base effect. Base effect means when the output of the sector is low, next sector is high, you get a higher growth rate. Hong Kong, very uneven recovery in different sectors. GDP growth we projected was minus 4.7%, but the actual minus 6.1%. So this is the largest sector in Hong Kong, wholesale and retail trade sector. What we notice is that in the first quarter of 2020, Hong Kong has a large drop. You will see this again in the next slide. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Singapore and Hong Kong at this stage. Let's look at Taiwan. So this is an interesting case. It's the resilience in Taiwan. Now, of course, Taiwan has a positive GDP growth for 2020, 3.1%. Now, this graph shows an index, real GDP index, by setting 2019 Q4 to 100 for easy comparison. As you can see, Taiwan, the blue line, is very little affected. So I'm not going to show all the impulse responses. They also look like this, very mildly affected. And Singapore is the orange line. Orange line is a V-shaped recovery. Hong Kong is a U-shaped recovery. So in 2020 Q1 itself, there is a large drop because there was a lot of unrest in Hong Kong before the onset of COVID-19. But both Singapore and Hong Kong have not come back to the pre-crisis level yet. Now, the sources of resilience. These are the three factors that I mentioned earlier. Pandemic containment. Taiwan did an excellent job in this regard. Taiwan did an excellent job in this regard. In our paper, we discussed them in detail. Now, as of April 17th, when I prepared these slides, total number of COVID cases in Taiwan was 1,072, with only 11 deaths. So if you rank these three economies based on number of cases per million, Taiwan has done pretty well. Fiscal support, all these economies are pretty well off. They have very good fiscal space to provide support. They have provided a lot of fiscal support. And built-in factors. So these are the ones I'm going to discuss. Now, this is the sector value-added shares of GDP of Taiwan in 2019. As you can see, Taiwan is a very, very manufacturing-dominated economy. Wholesale and retail trade sector is quite a distance from the manufacturing. Now, this seems to play a very key role. I'm not going to go through this. Now, where does this resilience come from? So when I did the regression estimates, I find Taiwan's manufacturing sector is very strongly linked to the Taiwan's foreign GDP variable. But despite that, the global downturn did not affect Taiwan much. Now, when we examine the data, it seems to be that there were two interwoven factors in operating in favor of Taiwan. One is the China effect. Here, China means mainland China. So otherwise, because ADB put Taiwan as Taipei, China. So largest weight or the export share in this foreign GDP variable is with China. Taiwan's export share with China has increased over time. It's 44% with China now, and Singapore is only 14%. So at this moment, at the COVID-19 case, because China did pretty well in containing the pandemic and the economy is growing, so this was a plus factor for Taiwan. This does not necessarily mean that is a strategy to follow, but at this stage, it worked in Taiwan's favor. The second point is more important. Manufacturing market diversification. When we looked at the data, what we find is only about 50% of manufacturing output is exported to Taiwan. The rest is gone to the domestic economy. In the case of Singapore, about 70% is exported. Of course, Singapore's domestic market is small. And that's one aspect. The other is the supply chain of Taiwan did not get disturbed much by the global downturn. Domestic value-added share of manufacturing exports of Taiwan is about 62%. In Singapore, it's about 50%. Foreign value-added share of manufacturing of Taiwan, China is the largest, 6.64%. Japan is the next, 4.68%. So the value chain is pretty diversified. Then there's probably a third factor, increased demand for electrical and electronic products during the pandemic. We did not look into these data. There is a possibility. So given that the manufacturing sector was largely insulated, and manufacturing sector has a very large presence in all the other sectors, we were quite surprised to see that. So these are the sector weights from input-output table, 2016 input-output tables, manufacturing weight in different sectors. So agriculture, very large weight is in manufacturing. Accommodation and food sector, which heavily depends on tourism, also there is a large presence of manufacturing. Education, there is a large presence of manufacturing. Healthcare, large presence of manufacturing. So this is probably because of the electronic products. Taiwan produces a lot of electronic products. That could be the reason why this is the case. Even in some other sectors, manufacturing sector at least number 2. So therefore, this spillover effect to other sectors protected the Taiwan sectors. So that's basically the built-in factors. The next question is restructuring and growth. Restructuring and growth. I'm not going to talk much on this, but restructuring is already happening. Many countries have gone for paperless transactions, saves the forest. But countries may go back to business as usual for faster growth. This is a bit of a worry. We already saw how quickly the environment came into life because of the COVID-19 restrictions. But countries may go back. So therefore, World Bank, in just a recent report released, emphasizes green growth. One whole part of that report is about green growth. So this is something worth paying attention to. So we need country-specific studies to understand the bottlenecks the countries face. Now, green growth. Problem of overproduction or overconsumption. I put this up because some people tend to think there is a problem of overconsumption. Actually, when you think of it, it could be overproduction. Now, depreciation versus product obsolescence. A few years ago, I worked out a time series of manufacturing sector capital stock of Singapore. So when I worked out this, and the standard method of working out the capital stock is the perpetual inventory method. What you do, you assume a fixed depreciation rate and then accumulate investment. So I went to the survey data. Economic Development Board conducts annual survey of the manufacturing sector. It's called Census of Industrial Production. I looked at from these data, I worked out the depreciation rate. What I observed was the depreciation rate has increased over time. Why? Because of product obsolescence. Nowadays, there is, people don't repair. If you ask to repair a machine, they say it's better to buy a new one. The repair cost is much higher. So therefore, there is a a lot of wasteful production that is taking place. So it looks like supply-induced demand is there. In health economics, we talk about supply-induced demand. This is also operating in many industries. And today is the Earth Day. Many countries have signed up for Biden's call, for environmental, rejuvenate the talks on environment. In this case, I want to quote this Mahatma Gandhi's statement: enough resources to satisfy our needs, but not enough to satisfy our greed. So in this regard, shall we go for consumption-driven growth, or is there an alternative? I tend to think we have to go back to the classical economics principle, that is, supply creates its own demand. If we manage the supply side in an environmental friendly way, then it will create a sufficient demand. That is where I leave the question mark, and I managed to end as I planned. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tilat, for the insightful sharing. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Sia Tao-Jin to present his paper.
Yeah, okay, good afternoon. Thank you for having me in the session. So I'm Tao-Jin from the Asia Competitiveness Institute, and this is joint work with my colleagues here, Amu, Jingzhi, and Changtai is now with the Tsinghua University. So this is about the evolving role of China and ASEAN production network between SARS and COVID-19 cases. Okay, so we talk about Asia. So the most Asia and pandemics. So the first thing that comes to people's mind is probably that, okay, there had been SARS and now there's COVID-19. And there are two episodes are both about pandemic, and how would these two episodes be different or similar across time. So if you see the graph here, on the left-hand side with the GDP growth during the SARS pandemic, and we see that the impact on GDP is quite brief, except for the case of Singapore when there's a very short period of decline. But for the other countries, they are mostly quite resilient, as we say. I mean, that's the key word today. Okay, so on the right panel, we have the COVID-19's GDP performance for different countries. So this is more synchronized movements in terms of GDP. So you see that almost all of the ASEAN countries had a decline since the first quarter of 2020. So there has been the distinct difference in the GDP growth in the two episodes. So what has driven the GDP growth across the two episodes? We think that there are two channels where the transmission of shocks can be spread across countries in a pandemic. So first, of course, is the higher degree of contagiousness. So when the contagiousness is higher, there will be a larger larger losses in terms of the labor force because people are quarantined, some people died, and that causes supply side disruption in the production sector. And on the other hand, there's also economic lockdowns when governments think that the pandemic is so serious that they need to restrict some of the economic activities. And at this moment, so we have demand side disruptions, which limits the demand for goods and services. And on the economic side, there's been evolving economic landscapes over the years. Services sector has expanded in China since the early 10s, and then the regional production network has been more integrated over the years too. So China has been more integrated to the regional production network. So that's the two distinct difference between SARS and COVID-19. Although Asia serves as a good example because they are both pandemic episodes and at the same time they are, within the same region. But the challenge for us is that COVID-19 is indeed more contagious. As we say, such a more contagious disease is likely to cause more disruptions in the economic activities. And at the same time, countries are more integrated. So can we really segregate the impact by each channel? And the reason is that once we segregate the channels, we are able to see how economics integration or economic cooperations can play a role in the spread of pandemic shock. And with these findings, we can find out going forward as we go for recovery, will this economic integration be helpful in the recovery path of the countries or not. So yeah, so our paper is available online. You can download, you can scan the code to download, and it's forthcoming on economic modeling. Okay, so let's look at the data for China and the region's production network. We see that for the goods, so this is the value added for ASEAN's exports from different sources. And we see that China's contribution to ASEAN's exports has been increasing over the years. So in 2005, it was about 3.6%, and it increased to 8% over the 10-year span. For the service production sector, there's a similar trend, although the number is much smaller. But in 2005, it's about 0.9% contribution from China, and it increased to 2.1% in 2015. So this is the increasing involvement in China's production in the ASEAN's exports. And at the same time, within China, we see the expansion of service sector in China increase from 40% in the pre-SARS period to 54% in the pre-COVID-19 period. And China has also been improved in the upstream position in the production network. That means it's going further back to the development side as compared to the end that's closer to the consumer market. And there's also greater participation in regional network rather than global network. So that means China has been increasingly cooperating with the regional economies as compared to the global economies. So these are the changes basically across the two episodes of pandemic in the economic landscape. And we want to see how this changing economic landscape contributes to the spread of the pandemic shock. And in order to do this, we use a model with population health dynamics. And we introduce this population health dynamics to China and ASEAN production network. This is based on the SIR macro model developed by Eichenbaum, Regression, and Taiwan in 2020. And we extend it to multiple countries. So in the feature of this model is that economic dynamics are solely driven by an infection, a very initial infection of the population. And because people realize the health risk of this disease, they make their rational economic choice, leading to dynamics in demand and supply of the economic sectors. And we assume that there has been highly infectious sector and less infectious sectors in the economy, so that when consumers or governments try to lock down the economy or try to reallocate the activities across different sectors of the economy, there is reallocation of economic demand across different sectors. So particularly we talk about service sector, which is usually the more infectious one, and the goods producing sector, which is the less infectious. And then the transmission mechanism will go as this. Initially, there's a small infection in the population, and then household will know about the health risks, and they decide to consume more in the manufacturing sector and consume less in the service sector. So this is also a result of the government lockdowns when they try to close the restaurants, and then people will just go for food delivery and so on. And so because of the changes in the demand for goods and production, the demand for the intermediate inputs will also change accordingly, because intermediate inputs are needed for the production of final outputs. And in the case of a more integrated international production network, this change in demand for intermediate inputs will be greater when the production network is more integrated across the countries. So in this model, we try to control for the population health dynamics. So that means across the two episodes of SARS and COVID-19, the health dynamics will remain the same. So the only change in the effect of the pandemic will be due to the change in the economic landscape across these two decades, these two episodes. So this is how we identify the transmission channel via the production network. So yeah, so in the model, we simulate the population health data using some of the key parameters like the infection rates, removal rate, and fatality rate. So then we simulate the different health dynamics for different group of people. So you see that there's a hump shape in the infected curve. So this is the case, and this is the time when a lot of when the infected population reaches its peak, and at the same time the consumers will realize the risk is the highest of getting infected, and there's some risk of being dead. So they will reallocate their activity. They'll consume more in the goods sector, and they'll consume less in the services sector. So this combined effect will lead to an economic recession in the economy. So that's how this model is done. And we start the simulation with two steady states. The first is the pre-SARS steady state, where we use the 2002 input-output table. And there's a pre-COVID-19 steady state, which we use the 2015 input-output table, because after 2015, there are a lot of things going on, like trade wars and different dynamics. So we want a relatively more calm period to use as the pre-COVID-19 period to do our simulation. So it's reduced to 3 countries: China, ASEAN, and the rest of the world, with 2 sectors in the economy, which is the goods and services. So you can see that there's been increase in global output. There have been the price has been standardized to 2015 price. So although this is a 2-sector, 3-country model, we can definitely extend it to a multi-country and multi-sector model. But this is just for demonstrating that there is a reallocation, and at the same time there's an effect from the integrated production network. Okay, so as for the results, we can see that on impacts, this service sector is definitely suffering during the COVID-19, during any of the pandemics. So the dashed line is the scenario for COVID-19. Dashed line is for SARS, while the solid line is for COVID-19, and the green line is for the ASEAN country, and the blue line is for China economy. So we see that the COVID-19 has actually resulted in a larger impact in the service sector as well as in the goods producing sector. So we expect to see goods producing sector to increase because people opt for more manufacturing goods rather than services goods. And we see that compared across the SARS and COVID-19 episode, we see a deeper decline in the services sector. So the evolving production network actually has an impact on the larger impact of COVID-19 on the services sector. And also the goods sector has a larger change across the 2 episodes too. And because of the change in outputs and final demand, we see a similar pattern in terms of the intermediate inputs demand. So similarly, we see a larger impact across the 2 episodes, and we also see for the goods producing sector, there's a larger impact as well, right? As for the exports, the impact is even greater in the ASEAN. So ASEAN's exports has been deteriorated. I mean, the service exports has been very much large. Has seen a much larger impact in terms of the export services. For the goods services, there's also a similar. The difference between the 2 episodes are also much larger. Yeah, so that's basically the impact of the production network. But the simulated number seems to be larger as compared to what we observed from the data. And we look at how China actually contains its disease. So in this case, we try to simulate what happens if China tries to contain its pandemic, so that the peak infection can be reduced from 1% of the population to about 0.425%. So we see that as China reduces its peak infection, the impact on the total output in both ASEAN and China has been reduced. And this has some positive implications for the regional recovery, because once China is able to contain its pandemic, the production network will back to function, and all the import-export demand will back to normal. And then the economy are going to return to their usual, the pre-pandemic status. So that's what we observed from the data. last week, when China was just released its economic performance for Q1 of 2021, we see that there's been a 18.3% increase in the GDP growth year on year for Q1 2021. And we also see that following China's growth in the second quarter of 2020, in Q3 of 2020, most of the ASEAN economies have already seen some uptick in their GDP growth. And in fact, in the Q1 of 2021, we see a positive increase in Singapore's GDP growth already. So that's would somehow prove that the China's recovery actually has led the ASEAN economies back to its recovery path. So just some concluding remarks. So in this model, we uncover the role of production network and economic landscapes as a transmission channel for pandemic shocks. And we have a model with a simple model, but it's useful in projecting the sectoral recovery path of pandemic. It can also be embedded in mainstream, the larger models like the CGE or DSG models to look at the final sectoral performance. So our conclusion is that the evolving production network has actually contributed to the larger cross-border spillover impacts of COVID-19 because countries are getting more involved in the production network. So the shock in one country is more easily spilled over to the other country. But this also has a positive implication. Once the pandemic is contained, the recovery will be strong because China has been recovering and its contained its pandemic quite successfully. And it's more likely that the ASEAN economies will also follow a China-led recovery in the future. So that will be all from me, and thank you.
Thanks, Tao-Jun. Now I'd like to invite Professor Zheng Huan to present on her research on cross-border FDI, please.
Thank you, Terence. Let me share my screen. Okay, so this is about how multinational investment respond to the COVID-19. And it is a joint work with Paul Chong and Yan Zhu from ACI. I'm Huan Zheng from the Kuan School of Public Policy. So this is a very preliminary work. So any welcomes would be much appreciated. Any comments would be much appreciated. So ever since the outbreak of COVID-19, various studies have been dedicated to evaluate the economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic. So we have documented various evidence that the COVID-19 would slow down the economic growth and reduce the total factor productivity. And there's also a large literature dedicated to explore the impact of pandemic on consumption. So they conclude with consistent evidence that pandemic reduced the consumption significantly. And there were a small amount of studies dedicated to study the investment by small medium enterprise and venture capitalists. Most of the study based on survey data, and they also document a decline in business activities like investment, firm investment, and the rising risk aversion. Most of the studies focus on domestic economy and with limited international evidence. Luckily, for this webinar, most of our studies are international. So here in this context, we are particularly interested in the cross-border investment flows. So this will serve as important intermediaries to transmit the risk across border, and they also serve as a channel to diversify risk. We are interested in the investment implication of pandemic-driven economic shocks in global markets. So in particular, we asked the following questions. How would the foreign direct investment, which is long-term oriented and costly reverse, respond to the COVID pandemic? So this will reflect investors' long-term view of where they see the COVID, the evolution, and its future impact on the investment. This is very important, especially when considering the importance of long-term investment for economic recovery. So as we all know, investment, especially long-term investments, are crucial for economic recovery, and it's a leading indicators of future economic growth. It's a significant component of investment. FDI, cross-border investment, is a very significant component of investment for emerging markets. Even for a relatively developed market like Singapore, FDI still accounts for about 30% of GDP, which is quite large. An important reason why we take FDI into account in this context is that FDI is an growth engine for many developing markets, and there are various evidence showing that FDI improves productivity. So it also generates significant spillover to the economy. For example, it transfers technology and knowledge, which is very important for the early growth of a market. And our previous study also shows that FDI is paving a way towards recovery. So this is an important investment during the recession. So having higher FDI during recession would indicate faster growth in the future. So we are interested here how COVID infections will potentially affect FDI. So there are several mechanisms that COVID could possibly affect FDI, and it's pointing towards a negative impact. As highlighted by Taojin and Tilak previously, the COVID infection serves as an indicator of economic shocks. So various studies have documented its negative impact, which might be too early to be reflected in some sort of data, but these infections clearly indicate shocks. If not realized now, could be realized in the future. So with these negative economic shocks, it indicates a low profitability for business. So such a low profitability would potentially undermine the foreign direct investment, who is profit seeking. And COVID-19 also disrupt business operation. So there were various containment policy that restrict human mobility as well as business goods mobility. So it disrupts the supply chain. So for some firms, they might not be able to get the necessary inputs, might have to reallocate their production facility in order to access the inputs required for their production. Or some firms might not be able to get the labor to get, might not be able to run the factory properly when there's a strict containment policy. So in this case, they might have to think about the relocation of the production facility to resume their production. And there are also various other reasons they might disrupt the cross-border investment. For example, the travel ban has reduced the physical connections internationally, especially with the declining in the airline operations. The physical connections across border has declined significantly, and such a declining in the air connections is a big blow to the business activities. So for the cross-border investment, it's businessmen needs to travel frequently to investigate the destination markets opportunities, to negotiate with the local government or to obtain this document for their operation or for their opening in a particular market. All these require physical interaction. Without physical interaction, it would be very difficult to carry out some activities, especially for activities they require on-site visits. So based on these arguments, we sort of come up with a preliminary conjecture that COVID infection are likely to deter foreign direct investment. So if you look at the global trend of the FDI, ever since the COVID-19, the global FDI have been declining consistently. So this is just resuming, or maybe we can say the it's accelerating the declining trend that exists even before the outbreak of COVID-19. And if you were to break down the foreign direct investment into by the entry mode, which is cross-border mergers and acquisition and Greenfield. So Greenfield FDI refers to setting up a factory or facilities in the destination market. So this is about setting something new. And mergers and acquisition is about acquiring something that already exists in the destination markets. So if you were to look at these two types of FDI, Greenfield FDI and cross-border mergers and acquisition, you can see that most of the decline were driven by the Greenfield FDI. So this is intuitive in the sense that a Greenfield FDI refers to setting up something new from the scratch. So unavoidably, they will need to visit the on-site, and they would have to seek approval with the government official. They might need to interact with them. All this would relies more heavily on physical interaction, and with the travel ban, this would be more difficult to. The Greenfield FDI will be relatively difficult. Whereas for the cross-border mergers and acquisition, this is about purchasing an ownership in an existing firm. So the negotiation can be done, for example, through a Zoom, or they could be carried out through the agency. And the reliance on the on-site activities would be relatively low. So there might be driven the differences between the cross-border mergers and acquisition and Greenfield FDI in terms of their response to the COVID-19. So we're going to explore further whether this is the case. So this chart plot growth in FDI by investment destination. So we focus on 2 years, one in 2019 and the other in 2020, which is the first year after the outbreak of COVID-19. So we calculate FDI growth as the log differences between FDI in 2020 relative to that in 2019. So as you can see, the Asia Pacific generally receive more FDI growth, or they suffers less FDI decline. So this is a heat map showing the FDI growth by destination, with darker color corresponding to higher FDI growth or lower FDI declining. So as you can see here, Asia Pacific receive relatively more FDI compared to the other markets. And if you were to look at similar heat map for COVID infection as of 2020, you can see the Asia Pacific were among those that were least affected by the COVID compared to the other countries. So this is a cumulative measure by the end of the 2020. So FDI growth is relatively high in regions that's affected with COVID-19. So if you compare these two charts, the darker color is now corresponding to lighter color. Okay, lighter color here correspond to lower COVID infection. So it seems to suggest that, in regions with less COVID-19 cases, the FDI growth seems to be larger. So if you were to look at Singapore, which has managed the COVID-19 cases relatively successfully compared to the other markets, you see the decline, many occurs before 2020. And since the outbreak of the COVID-19, the FDI declines, but the declining rate is not as pronounced as those we show for the world market. And we see similar patterns that the Greenfield, which is highlighted by the red line, is declining more than the cross-border mergers and acquisition, which is represented by the green line. So we see similar patterns, but we see a slower decline for Singapore, which is managing the COVID-19 cases relatively well. So we are going to explore the impact of COVID-19 on foreign direct investment in the regression setup. So before going to the methods, I would like to walk you through the methodology briefly, the data briefly. So we use the data, monthly data from 2019 to 2020. So there are 2 years data, 1 year before COVID-19 and about 1 year after the COVID-19. Of course, the outbreak of COVID-19 varies across country. And we are interested in the bilateral FDI from source market, which is where the multinational firms are located, to the destination market, which is the location that receive the investment from the multinational firms. We are focusing on 2 types of FDI. One is Greenfield FDI, which refer to setting up brand new factories in the destination market. And we are also interested in the brownfield FDI. In particular, we are interested in the cross-border mergers and acquisition in the brownfield FDI. And these data are from the obvious. Since we're interested in the FDI's response to COVID-19, we get the data on COVID-19 cases from the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. So we tackle differences in the COVID affection case between the destination market and source market. And to ensure the comparability between destination and source market, we normalize the newly infected cases by the total population. So essentially, we're calculating the differences in COVID infection. All right. So because we are interested in a location of FDI, so we take the differences of COVID cases in the destination market and relative to that in the source market. So this gives us a relative measure of COVID affection. And to understand how various policies or various connections could possibly shape the impact of COVID-19 on foreign direct investment, we further look at some COVID policy from the Oxford database, and we also get the social connection data from Facebook. And finally, we also obtain some gravity terms from the CPII. So our baseline regression is very simple. We simply estimate response of foreign direct investment to COVID-19 by employing this simple regression. We regress the log 1 plus FDI on the COVID affection. Okay, we control for the country pair effect to absorb any historical linkage between the source and destination market, or they might have unique linkage. For example, they share the same language or they were very close to each other. And we also include this time fixed effect to absorb all possible impacts of global factors. And finally, we control for the destination year and source year and destination year fixed effect. This is to absorb all the push and pull factors. They are driving the foreign direct investment to the destination market, or they were, pushing the foreign direct investment from the source market outside. So these absorb all possible macro factors that could affect the allocation of FDI. So our key variable of key parameter of interest is beta. If beta is negative and statistically significant, it means that COVID infection discourage foreign direct investment. Recall here again that COVID here is the differences newly affected case as a ratio of population, and it's calculated as differences between destination market and source market. So you can think about it as the relative COVID infection in destination market relative to the source market. Before the outbreak of COVID-19, naturally, this number would equal to 0. Okay, so we are going to estimate this model and see whether COVID infection indeed affect foreign direct investment. So if it is, it might provide some evidence that foreign direct investment is actually moving from destination markets, is moving to destination market that's affected by a pandemic. So it also reflects the reallocation of capital from relatively risky region to relatively safe region. So this is our baseline results. As you can see, if we were to regress FDI on the COVID this coefficient is negative and statistically significant at 5% level. So it shows that for every 1 percentage point increase in new infection in the destination market relative to the source market, FDI would drop by 9%. So this is quite significant, quite large in terms of the magnitude. So it supports our hypothesis that the COVID infections would deter the foreign direct investment. So if we were to break down the foreign direct investment into greenfield and cross-border mergers and acquisition, here's what we found. So we see a negative and statistically coefficient of COVID in the greenfield FDI regression, but this coefficient is not statistically significant for cross-border mergers and acquisition. Okay, so if we were to have 1% increment of infection in the destination market, the greenfield FDI would decline by 12%, but the mergers and acquisition would barely change. So if you were to further compare the differences between the two, we find that the differences is significant at 1% level. So it tells us that greenfield FDI are more responsive to COVID cases than the cross-border mergers and acquisition. And if we were to deal with the zero observations and heteroscedasticity in our data, we can run the PPML, which is the Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood estimation. And after addressing these issues, we still find similar results that greenfield FDI are more responsive to COVID than cross-border mergers and acquisitions. So why is this the case? So if you were to dig into the greenfield FDI again, this building new factories and facilities require on-site investigation both before and after the investments. So in order to close the, in order to finalize the investment, they would have to interact with the government frequently. And not all governments are as digitalized as Singapore government. So you would expect a lot of on-site approval. You would need to submit some document on-site, talk to the government official on-site. But if you were to look at cross-border mergers and acquisition, it's about purchasing existing facilities from ownership. And these things, like when you're buying stocks or bonds, a lot of them could be actually done through online system. And the only thing is that this cross-border mergers and acquisition requires sophisticated understanding of the preference, culture, and norms of both the target and acquirers. So you need to know both sides very well in order to close the deals. So again, this is more informal. On-site interaction would improve the efficiency or increase the probability of closing the deal faster. But there are alternatives. They could be substituted using online communication or other type of social connections. So because of this difference, we expect the travel bans that reduce international connections to affect greenfield FDI more than the cross-border mergers and acquisition. Because the greenfield FDI seems to rely more on physical interaction. But cross-border mergers and acquisition, there seems to be a lot of activities that could be substituted by social connections or other forms of online interaction. So we were wondering whether social connection might be able to substitute physical connection for cross-border mergers and acquisition. And we are wondering whether this is a reason why cross-border mergers and acquisition are less responsive to COVID-19 compared to the greenfield FDI. So we utilized the social connection index from Facebook friendship data, but unfortunately we couldn't find any evidence that social connection is shaping the differences between the greenfield FDI and cross-border mergers and acquisition. So one possibility is that this friendship connection is more social and more for entertainment and less business oriented. So they might be able to transmit information on how you should deal with COVID or some social norms, but it contains relatively less information about how you should conduct business across borders. So they might possibly be driving the ineffectiveness of social connections via Facebook friendship. But we do find something in other type of relation. When we look at the common colonial history, between source and destination market. So if they share common colonial history, they will share similar culture, institution, rules, and laws, and this makes them easier to understand each other. And because they have a similar way of doing business, and the communication will be much easier for them, and the information transmission through online system would be also much more efficient. So we include in this common colonial history and see how it shaped the shaped the impact of COVID on cross-border, on FDI. And we find that this common colonial history would weaken the response of cross-border mergers and acquisition to COVID-19, which is highlighted by the positive and significant coefficient of the interaction term. But we don't find similar evidence for Greenfield FDI. So it kind of support our previous argument that the social connection might be able to substitute some physical connections for cross-border mergers and acquisition, but less so for Greenfield FDI. So finally, we explored whether multinational firms value the COVID-19 policy. So there are two ways to understand this. If they expect COVID policy to be effective in curbing future COVID cases, then they will be less responsive to today's COVID infection. But on the other hand, with stringent COVID policy, it will reduce the mobility of both people and goods, and interrupt the business operation further. So in this case, we might expect COVID policy to strengthen the response of FDI to infection. So we are wondering which effect might dominate. So to deal with this, we interact the COVID policy with the COVID infection, and this is what we found. So if we were to strengthen the COVID policy, you can see that it strengthens the impact of COVID-19 on foreign direct investment. So, and in addition, if you look at the coefficient of policy stringency directly, the coefficient is also negative. It means that the COVID policy also directly discourages FDI. So this speaks to our story on how COVID policy restrict the mobility, which disrupt the business and then discourage foreign direct investment. So if you were to look at the differences between Greenfield and cross-border mergers and acquisition again, we see that COVID policy strengthens the response of FDI to COVID infection, mostly through this cross-border mergers and acquisition. So finally, this is the conclusion. Basically, we find that COVID-19 deters foreign direct investment, and the impact differs across the entry modes. And there are some social connection that could substitute the physical connection, but not all kinds of social connection has similar roles. And finally, we show that stringent containment policies strengthen the impact of COVID-19 on FDI. So there's a, it's a double-edged sword when it comes to the impact on FDI. Yeah, that will be my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juan, for giving us much food for thought. Now, may I invite Dr. Toh Man Heng to share his comments, please?
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, first, I'd like to congratulate all the writers. I think they are putting great effort to produce such a useful paper. I think they're very interesting. Now, my comment, because I got the paper by Juan a bit late, so my comment is really off the cuff subsequently. Okay, I will start with this. I mean, the world is, in fact, can be described by the popular acronym VUCA, V-U-C-A. Basically, it means that very volatile, very uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So in fact, the COVID pandemic and its consequences that make it so-called obvious and perhaps easier to understand. Now, Asia may have actually suffered first from the coronavirus, but there is no such thing as a first mover advantage in dealing with a pandemic. The more resilient a society, the better place it is to cope with a variety of risks and challenges. But to become resilient, a society needs to face a setback and learn from them. So, and to remain resilient, it needs to stay aware of its own vulnerabilities and avoid complacency. So in fact, economic resilience can be strengthened by implementing policies aimed at mitigating both the risks and the consequences of severe crisis. Now, in the case of risks, this implies being able to monitor homegrown vulnerabilities. Coping with the consequences means identifying policy setting and mechanism that can be put in place ex ante, so to help absorbing the impact of a severe downturn. Now, however, well, being from economics perspective, however, the benefits of such policy needs to be balanced against the costs in terms of the lower growth. So now, in fact, here I would like to talk about something, since this is a seminar on resilience and recovery. So that actually brings me to a sort of my favorite. A country can be very vulnerable. So as such, being very vulnerable, you need to be resilient. So the pandemic in some way actually put a lot of the policymaker into a state of a so-called, it's not just theory, but it's a practice. And also in the process, it's a test of really, when we talk about resilience, are we really resilient? Now, many small countries, right, manage to generate relatively high GDP per capita when compared to other developing countries, in spite of their high exposure to external economic shock. Now, this is often termed what we call vulnerability paradox. Now, this phenomenon was termed by another researcher, because he was also a guy that investigated all this question about resilience and vulnerability. So the person is Briguglier. I can't pronounce it very well, but Briguglio, Briguglier. And in fact, he will term this vulnerability paradox as Singapore paradox. So why is that so? So I have a picture here about this vulnerability. I hope I can make it back. Okay. So this is a standard so-called 2x2 matrix, which you can see that on one axis is about resilience from low to high. And then on the vertical axis is about vulnerability from low to high. So in fact, you'll find that there are 4 cases being identified here. You have one is the worst case, where very high vulnerability and very low resilience. That's something that you would not want to be in. The second one is, they call it self-made, that you have very high vulnerability and yet you also have very high resilience. This is a case where they will say that it is perhaps well described by the situation of Singapore. Now then you have the third case where you call it a prodigal son, where you have a low vulnerability and low resilience, right? It's one sort of a trap economy. But the best case is where you have very low vulnerability and very high resilience. So, but that is something that is desirable, but often it is not the case. So with this, then this a sort of a matrix, then there's also this question mark. Why is it so that you can be in a situation of high vulnerability and yet with high resilience? Then that means that there are some factors which may offset the disadvantage associated with the vulnerability. In fact, often we say the people who are very frightened of death will make a lot of preparation how to avoid death. All right, so here in the case that for survival purposes, right, let's say for small states like Singapore, the more vulnerable you are, the more you want to be prepared in any situation that able to rebound very quickly, right? But rebounding is one, because rebounding for a resilient, we say rebounding. So you will find that in many studies, right, in fact, what we have done by all the previous speaker, right, in some way, you are trying hard to find out that how good an economy can rebound from a disaster. But in our case here, I think we are focusing on a pandemic, a crisis. So what are the sort of factors that will help in raising that sort of resilience? I think some has already been so-called pointed out in, I think, in the paper by Tila. And all right, so maybe I move on to a slightly different thing, maybe a bit more macro in perspective, not specific to just the pandemic. Now they find that countries that are able to have that sort of shock absorbing and shock counteracting resilience, right? They will have something like, what broadly speaking, macroeconomic stability, microeconomic efficiency, good governance. And last but not least, the fourth factor is with very good social development, in particular social capital, of course, is also referring to the cohesiveness of the society. Now, other than these four, then often people also talk about prior experience of crisis and disturbance. In other words, that countries that have often, have experienced a pandemic may be in a better position to prevent the next pandemic, right? So, well, but often also there's another finding. It may actually breed the kind of being complacent, right? So if, like in Singapore, if everybody thinks that, oh, the rate of infection is so low, then everybody will say, why should I start wearing, why should I wear a mask? Why can't I just gather? So that is the other side of the story, right? So in any case, so the important, I think, message here is how we can avoid the complacency and to remain resilient. Now, what I want to move on is to talk about, right, the paper, since I'm asked to be a discussion paper. So all three papers, as I mentioned earlier, are very good paper. So let me start with the Tila's paper. I think it's a fantastic effort from my perspective, is that it is a lot of work there, right, to make the quantify the resilience associated with the recovery. So you may see a lot of all these so-called standard conventional V-shape. Then you may say, so what? But I would suppose that the proof of the pudding is in its eating. But in our case here, I think what I have read is that the model is used for forecasting. No doubt Tila say that the purpose is not for forecasting. But I think there's the effort being done subsequently based on the data before the crisis, the crisis, and then after that, right? Juxtapose it with what actually happened, and you find that the model has performed well, right? Except for one or two cases, because of sectoral cases. I think that is it says something about it. I mean, it is a good model that can be useful. All right. Now, in the mention of green growth, okay, fine. I mean, here during the presentation, I think yes, that movement, if they're being or this international institution say that yes, we should actually, if there's a recovery, don't forget climate change, don't forget the environmental impact. So move over to green. Fine, I think it is, right? I mean, some may say it is not a time to talk about environmental issue. So we want to recover. Let's put aside. But well, I suppose that it is also important that at the same time we should be worried about the negative side of production. Now, talk about overproduction. You may find that in the world, a lot of all these shops and so-called factory outlets. In fact, at one time I was asking the same question: why are there so many factory outlets selling goods so-called at a great discount? someone just simply tell me, do you know that the whole world, if everybody, right, if you were to put the number of t-shirts or shirts or those apparels together, the whole world can be dressed 3 times over. In other words, there's more than enough of those apparel, whether it's t-shirt, shirt, or whatever, rather than, so it's actually oversupply. And as such, you have all these factory outlets just to get rid of the excess supply, because every year they want to come up with a new fashion, right? So they have to get rid of it. Okay, that's on green growth. But I have a question, maybe Tilap can maybe highlight, can enlighten us. The model itself, to me, they are short run. It actually able to mimic the situation in the past, and on the assumption that what the dynamics in the past can be pushed forward. So I am more worried about how does this pandemic affects our long-term growth, especially in Singapore case, right? So yeah, with the pandemic, there's actually destruction of human capital, destruction of physical capital, destruction of certain knowledge become obsolete very quickly. So how can that be actually quantified? Maybe not easy. So I would suppose a certain part of the in modeling process, we always learn how can we actually improve on that. Okay, let me just go on to the next paper by Tao Jun. I think it's a very ingenious approach adopted, right? To identify the channels of transmission and then superimpose one on the other, and then to, as such, using it to have a peek on what will happen to the COVID. I think that is great. But in the process of the whole exercise, I mean, and the report and the finding, it seems that there's synchrony, right? Some sort of synchrony between the Chinese economy and the ASEAN economy. Is it good? Well, I would suppose that both sides, it can be a danger, but at the same time also a blessing. Because when China were to recover very quickly, that means ASEAN also can recover very quickly. So why not? But I hope that in that process, then ASEAN also have to diversify, have to strengthen the intra-ASEAN cooperation, right? Be more open and even to participate in just more than one supply chain. You cannot just depending on one. So more cooperation in building regional resilience, and then such as things as single window, energy cooperation, e-ASEAN, those things I suppose that it's not only for individual country, but as a region as a whole, that will provide us what we call regional resilience, rather than just simply a resilience for a particular country. Now, finally, I'll just move on to the third paper by Kuan. So, well, I think the implication I read from it, because I always think about Singapore economy, is that what sort of important implication does have of Singapore is so dependent on FDI, right? Now, so with this, after this COVID, I believe that there are certain fundamental changes in the sort of FDI landscape, especially for Singapore, the kind of strategy that we are adopting. So the pandemic is some sort of accelerated the move away from the sort of conventional FDI. So no doubt the distinction about Greenfield, M&A, fine, but I think that there might be a move towards more technocentric kind of FDI, right? And there will be more important types of, for example, the importance of FDI, not necessarily in terms of the physical presence. As such, that will bring us to important dimension, in particular, together with all this globalization, digitalization, and robotization, automation, all this shun, that actually means that there's need of new thinking. So let me move on to the metrics that I have in mind. Is this shoring and sourcing metrics? Right, this shoring sourcing metrics, in applying it, so you can find that, all right, we have a lot of talk during the pandemic, a lot of all these FDI say, hey, why not bring it back home? Right, rather than go overseas, especially people cannot move. You want it to, some will use the word backshoring. I think I saw it in the chat, somebody meant backshoring. But actually, it's onshoring. You want to be onshore or offshore. That is geographical location. The other is whether you want to carry out that particular item of production, or you may be producing a component. You want to do it, in-house or overseas. So, of course, from the perspective of having FDI, then it's important to talk about offshoring. We hope that country or companies still make the decision that of course, the ultimate decision is about cost. If they still find that the cost is the cost in having offshoring, then we are thinking about, okay, the conventional one, so offshore, right, with insourcing, then that will be our standard FDI. But there's also offshoring, but outsourcing. So from the perspective of Singapore, we like both. All right, we hope that they will continue the sort of standard FDI, but at the same time, we have to be prepared in terms of, right, as a hub for more companies of different MNC or what have you, a company of different tech capability that they can tap into. It's not necessary that they are investing. They can be buying important services from other companies that are so-called stationed in Singapore. So in terms of types of FDI, we actually will intensify the sort of FDI relating to HQ activities. We would prefer, all right, it's not about space. Now, if you move on to that sort of digital world, right, then it is not about, no necessity that you need that physical presence, especially when the goods you're talking about, right, can be digitalized. We are now moving into, whether we like it or not, because we are talking about automation, 3D printing, right, additive manufacturing. Those are things which it may not require, all right, the physical presence. But at the same time, in order to make a living, then the type of FDI Singapore would need is very different. You may have to emphasize more on the kind of digitalized kind of FDI. Okay, I think here just a parting word is that why do we actually worry about it? Because we are thinking is that the importance of the kind of FDI, no doubt, as a result of the pandemic, right? We may be finding that if we do not make the first move, then we are afraid, because in the digital world, a lot of things happen based on what we call winners takes all. If you make the first step, right, you are more likely to get the game. So it's a winners takes all perspective. So we have to move and have to move fast. Okay, I think that's what I would like to say for as a discussion for the 3 paper. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maheng, for those insights. Now, can we have Prof. Sanjana Goswami to quite briefly share on her comments, please? Thank you.
Okay, so we are running out of time quite a bit, so I will just very, very briefly say a few words. This is a chart which shows, based on 4 months ago, based on the current vaccine production and forecast for what vaccines are going to be available, including those made by all kinds of manufacturers, Russia, China, India, and others. It seems that widespread vaccination, which is where most of the population is vaccinated, is not going to be achieved anytime soon. So we're looking at maybe 2 to 3 years where we can think of life returning back to what it was, traveling freely wherever we want, going on vacations, businesses being able to do the kind of things that Kuan was suggesting, you go on site, examine, etc. So on top of that, this is assuming that things go to plan, that indeed the vaccination goes to plan and all of that. We are also seeing, as you might be aware, the things that are happening in Asia now. There are a few countries whose second waves, as you can see here, are double or in fact reaching triple numbers of what it used to be in the first wave. This is pretty troubling. then you get news of like new variants emerging. This is also problematic for epidemiological reasons. You want to squash this now so that, you know, at least the vaccines that are out there are going to be useful. So I will just say a few things here. We are 1 year into the pandemic, and some of the countries have done pretty well in Asia, right? The countries that we talked about earlier today, Singapore being one of them. But and that's largely because a lot of, you know, how they've traced, how they have had their quarantine rules and so on and so forth. But that is not something that is going to be sustainable for another couple of years, right? So I think instead of looking at the country level, now we really need to go beyond that and look at more of a regional level. So there is a lot of discussion about supply chain diversification. Now that is actually not really possible in the pandemic situation, right? If you can't go on site, can't make these investments. So really the main problem for economic recovery, so here we're not talking about the disease recovery, the economic recovery, the main impediment is uncertainty. Things keep changing, rules keep changing, cross-border flows keep changing. So going forward, these countries that have at least been successful in making their own countries safe for the people need to think a little bit beyond that. How do they try to get back into allowing the kind of businesses that used to happen before, the kind of trade and investment flows? So the first step would be having consistent rules. If businesses do not like uncertainty, so if they know exactly what is going to be 6 months from now, 1 year from now, then they can make those decisions and make those choices and operate. Some of these nations really need to coordinate. And I really think that there is a scope, because we've seen how resilient the supply chains have been, how resilient these in that paper with the ASEAN, you know, how within ASEAN itself, there is so much of the value chain. There is really a scope for all of these countries to come together and figure out a way in which they can facilitate these trade and investment flows. So I think economic recovery in Asia can really be led by this China-ASEAN linkage. And going forward, we don't need to look at just the country level, how well they are doing within the country, but across some of these. So beyond this, I had some comments prepared for some of the papers, but I think we're really short on time. So I'll reach out to the authors myself and let them know. So thank you.
Thank you, Sanjana, for giving us much to think about. There's been quite a number of comments in the Q&A, and I would like to thank Tao Jun and Huan for responding to some of them already. I think some of you can refer to them in the answered questions. But let me, in the remaining time we have, briefly select some questions and suggest some panelists to respond to them. I think first up, we have Sasi Buto, who asks, how can developing countries speed up the economic recovery? And how can developing countries walk the recovery road? I wonder whether Tilak or Manheng would like to address that.
As for developing countries, there is still an issue because a lot of countries provided relief, but casual observations show that, you know, the income loss is still much bigger than the relief people got. So this is the most important priority for many developing countries. And in developing countries, there are two groups of people. One is the urban poor, who, you know, depend on daily earnings, and then the rural people who depends very much on agriculture. So rural people are not very much affected, but it's the urban poor who need the support. So the question for developing countries is just to get sufficient relief to get people back on, you know, on their feet. So developed countries, they have, of course, enough fiscal resources. So it's a resource constraint that developing countries face.
Yeah, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to respond or add to that? If not, we have also a question from Nurul. We saw that during the pandemic, the information communication sector grew significantly due to limited movement of people. When viewed from the presentation showing that the post-COVID-19 economy is predicted to prioritize innovation-based strength, what do you think about investment opportunities from economic partners that can revive the post-pandemic economy? Wonder whether Huan would like to talk about investment.
Actually, we see some spike on the intensive cross-border investment activities. So there seems to be a shift in terms of FDI, the sectors that the FDI have been targeting. So if you were to compare traditional investment in the manufacturing with the investment on the innovations, the difference seems to be widened, but we don't have strict empirical evidence yet. So maybe this was reflecting another trend in technology investment.
Thank you. We also have a question on mediation. I'm not sure if any of the panelists would like to have a crack at that.
What's the mediation? Sorry, I didn't read the question. Mediation.
How mediation could assist to promote an alternative dispute resolution, and how could that impact the recovery?
Dispute resolutions, of course, always need some mediation. I'm not too sure how it relates to the recovery problem.
Right. Or maybe we could, sorry. If not, we can move on also to social resilience. Would anyone like to comment on that? Beyond economic resilience.
Yeah, social resilience is, again, casual observations coming in, working from home is not necessarily has done good thing. Though on one hand, it helped, containing the pandemic, but also that lead to a lot of social problems. Home fights, all these have increased, and so social resilience, requires people to move around. So long as the pandemic continues, there will be restrictions and the current wave. So social side, there is a suffering on the social side actually as a result of staying home throughout.
Thank you so much.
Just to add, resilience is very much effort, man-made effort. In contrast, vulnerability is a bit more like endowment, or is something that it is given. So resilience, I think I mentioned about social cohesiveness, and then also how much trust the government has, and of course is maybe is how the people behave also. So all this I think put together. We'll go back to the concept of how much social capital have already been built up. So the better the social capital, I would suppose that the higher the level of that resilience, if whatever you need to face in whatever crisis that you need to cope with. I think that's what I'd say. Thank you.
Actually, Manheng, you are suggesting a very interesting new hypothesis worth investigating. Higher the vulnerability, the more the resilience.
Yep, that's a paradox. but the as what Ming mentioned by all those researchers is that it is not really a paradox per se, because it's a human reaction. The more vulnerable you are becoming more prepared. So when you're more prepared, you are becoming more resilient. So perhaps a 2x2 matrix must go into a third to resolve the paradox which we observe in the 2x2. Maybe you have added another dimension that will make it no longer a paradox.
So on this note, I think we have answered most of the questions posed, and it brings us to the end of today's webinar. I'm sure you agree with me that it has been most enlightening and engaging, and also given us much food for thought. I would like to thank the presenters, discussants, and all participants for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Goodbye. Thank you.